There are some memories that remain sharp, no matter how many years pass. Of all the strange ventures I shared with Sherlock Holmes, few disturbed me as deeply as the affair of Charles Augustus Milverton. Even now, as I sit by my fire and let my thoughts wander back to those winter days, I feel the same chill that touched my heart on the evening when it all began. It was a bitterly cold night in London. Holmes and I had returned from one of our long walks through the frosty streets. The gas lamps outside glowed through a thin mist, and our sitting room at Baker Street felt warm and welcoming after the icy air. As Holmes lighted the lamp, his eyes immediately fell upon a visiting card lying on the table. He picked it up, glanced at the name, and with a look of disgust, tossed it onto the carpet. I bent down and read the card, Charles Augustus Milverton. There was also a short note written upon it, "Will call at 6:30. I looked up in surprise. I had never seen Holmes react so strongly to the name of a visitor. He had faced murderers, thieves, and desperate men without the slightest concern. Yet now there was something in his expression that I had rarely witnessed. It was not fear, it was hatred. Holmes sank into his chair beside the fire and stared into the flames. At last he spoke in a quiet voice. "Watson," he said, "the man who owns that card is the worst person in London." I felt a strange uneasiness settle over me. Outside, somewhere in the dark street below, I heard the distant sound of carriage wheels approaching Baker Street. The visitor was coming. The sound of the approaching carriage faded for a moment as it turned into Baker Street, and I looked once more at Holmes. He was still staring into the fire, his long fingers pressed together, his face unusually grave. I had often heard him speak of dangerous criminals. He respected some of them for their cleverness, and even admired a few for their courage, but never before had I heard such bitterness in his voice. I asked him who this Charles Augustus Milverton truly was. Holmes slowly lifted his eyes. "He's no murderer, Watson," he said. "At least, not in the way the law understands murder. I would rather spend an evening with the most violent killer in England than with this man." The answer only deepened my curiosity. Holmes leaned back in his chair. "Milverton destroys lives without lifting a weapon. He feeds upon secrets. He learns the hidden mistakes of others and then uses those secrets to force money from them." I began to understand. A blackmailer. Even in my years as a doctor and a soldier, I had seen the damage that fear and shame could cause. There were wounds far deeper than those made by bullets. Holmes continued, "There are men and women all across London who tremble at the sound of his name. He has ruined families, broken engagements, and driven decent people into despair." The fire crackled softly. "Why is he not in prison?" I asked. Holmes gave a weary smile. "Because his victims dare not accuse him. To expose him would often expose themselves. So he remains untouched, growing richer from the misery of others." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Holmes added quietly, "And tonight, Watson, he comes here because another life hangs in the balance." At that very instant, the wheels of the carriage stopped outside our door. A heavy knock echoed through Baker Street. Charles Augustus Milverton had arrived. Before our visitor arrived upstairs, Holmes spoke once more, and his voice had become calm and businesslike. "The matter concerns a young lady of high position," he said. "She is soon to be married, and her future happiness rests in the hands of this villain." I drew my chair closer to the fire. Holmes explained that the lady had written several affectionate letters years before. They contained nothing wicked, only the foolish emotions of youth. Yet, in the eyes of society, such letters could still cause terrible harm. Somehow, those private pages had fallen into the hands of Charles Augustus Milverton. "He threatens to send them to her future husband," Holmes said. "If he succeeds, the marriage will almost certainly end before it begins." I felt a deep sympathy for the unknown woman. "Who is she?" I asked. Holmes hesitated. Only a moment. "Lady Eva Brackwell." The name was familiar, even to me. She was admired throughout London for her beauty and kindness, and her engagement to the Earl of Dovercourt had filled the newspapers only weeks before. "And what does Milverton demand?" I asked. "A fortune," Holmes replied. "A sum far beyond what she can easily pay." I could not hide my anger. Surely no gentleman would profit from another person's misery in such a manner. Holmes gave a grim smile. "Milverton is no gentleman, Watson. He's a merchant of secrets. To him, human suffering is simply another business transaction." The firelight flickered across his sharp features. "I have promised Lady Eva that I will try to save her," he continued. "That is why I invited this man here tonight. I hope to persuade him to show mercy, though I confess I expect little from him." Outside, the sound of footsteps reached us on the stairs. A moment later, there came a knock at our door. Holmes rose slowly from his chair. "The worst man in London," he said softly, "has arrived." Mrs. Hudson showed our visitor into the room, and I understood at once why Holmes had spoken of him with such dislike. Charles Augustus Milverton was not an ugly man. In truth, his appearance was almost pleasant. He was short and heavily built, with a round face and a smooth forehead. A pair of gold-rimmed glasses rested upon his nose, and his gray eyes shone brightly behind them. His clothes were expensive and perfectly arranged. Yet there was something deeply disturbing about him. It was his smile. The expression never seemed to change. It sat upon his face like a painted mask, warm and friendly at first glance, but cold and false when one looked more closely. He entered our sitting room with complete confidence, as though he were visiting old friends. His hand stretched toward Holmes in greeting. Holmes did not take it. For a moment the smile seemed to grow even wider. Our visitor calmly removed his overcoat, folded it with great care, and sat down near the fire, as if he owned the room. His eyes turned briefly toward me. I felt at once that this man noticed everything. Nothing escaped him. The silence between him and Holmes seemed to fill the entire room. At last Milverton spoke in a smooth and gentle voice. He wished to know whether I could be trusted with the matter that had brought him to Baker Street. Holmes answered immediately. "I was his closest friend and partner." The blackmailer nodded slowly. He seemed perfectly satisfied. Then he folded his hands upon his stomach and looked directly at Holmes. The pleasant smile remained upon his face, but his eyes had become hard and bright, like pieces of polished steel. I had the strange feeling that a poisonous snake had quietly entered our sitting room and settled itself beside the fire. And then Charles Augustus Milverton began to speak of business. Charles Augustus Milverton sat comfortably before our fire, as though he were discussing the purchase of a house or a piece of land. There was nothing hurried or nervous about him. He knew the power he possessed. With his calm gray eyes fixed upon Holmes, he asked a simple question. Had we come prepared to accept his terms? Holmes remained perfectly still. Instead of answering, he asked what those terms might be. Milverton's frozen smile never moved. He named the sum. Even I, who knew little of the private affairs of the wealthy, felt a shock. It was an enormous amount of money. The blackmailer spoke of it as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. If the money were paid, the letters would be returned. If not, they would be delivered into the hands of the lady's future husband. The deadline was very near. Only a few days remained. I watched Holmes carefully. His face revealed nothing, yet I knew him well enough to see the anger growing behind his calm expression. There was something unbearable in hearing a man's happiness and a woman's future discussed as though they were goods being sold at a market. Holmes asked whether there could be some reduction in the demand. Milverton almost laughed. He explained that a wedding was a wonderful occasion for family and friends to be generous. Surely they could gather the money if the lady's reputation truly mattered. His voice remained smooth and pleasant. That, somehow, made his cruelty even worse. The fire crackled softly between them. I began to understand why Holmes hated this man more than many murderers. A murderer may strike in anger, but this man caused suffering slowly, carefully, and for profit. He traded in fear, and he seemed to enjoy every moment of it. At last Holmes spoke. His voice was calm and controlled, but I knew him well enough to hear the effort behind it. He explained that Lady Eva Brackwell was not a wealthy woman. The sum demanded by Milverton was impossible for her to raise. Even gathering a much smaller amount would place a heavy burden upon her and her family. Holmes then named a lower figure. It was still a considerable fortune, enough to satisfy any reasonable person. But Charles Augustus Milverton is not a reasonable man. He listened politely, his fingers folded upon his waistcoat, and that dreadful smile still resting upon his face. When Holmes had finished, the blackmailer slowly shook his head. The offer was refused. Not for a moment did he appear uncertain. It was plain that he had decided his price long before entering Baker Street. To him, the matter was already settled. Either the money would be paid in full, or the letters would be sent. Nothing else interested him. Holmes tried once more. He spoke of kindness, of mercy, and of the terrible consequences that might follow. Milverton listened as though he were hearing a child speak. Then he gently explained that ruining one victim could actually help his business. If society learned that he never accepted less than his demands, then others would pay him more quickly in the future. I felt a coldness run through me. The man was discussing misery as though he were speaking about investments and profits. A woman's happiness meant nothing to him. A broken heart was simply another lesson to be sold to future victims. I glanced toward Holmes. His face had become pale. His eyes, however, burned with a dangerous light. I had seen that expression before. It meant that his patience was almost at an end. And Charles Augustus Milverton, smiling pleasantly by our fire, seemed entirely unaware of the storm he was awakening. For several moments, the room was silent. The flames in the fireplace cast strange shadows upon the walls, and outside I could hear the distant rumble of a carriage passing through Baker Street. Charles Augustus Milverton seemed perfectly at ease. He had delivered his terms and expected obedience, just as a king expects tribute from his subjects. Holmes, however, remained standing before the fire. I knew every expression of my friend's face, and I could see that he was struggling to master his anger. At last he made one final appeal. He asked whether there was truly no possibility of mercy. Could the letters not be returned for a smaller sum? Could the future of the young woman not be spared? Milverton answered with a smile. Business was business. Feelings had no place in it. He even suggested that the destruction of the Lady Eva's happiness would serve as a useful example to others who might one day refuse his demands. The words had scarcely left his lips when Holmes suddenly rose from his chair. The movement was so swift that I myself started in surprise. His eyes flashed, and for an instant there was a look upon his face that I had only seen When he confronted the most dangerous criminals, I truly believed he might seize the man where he sat. Milverton noticed it as well. In a single smooth motion, he placed one hand inside his coat. The gesture was small, yet full of meaning. He was armed. The smile never left his face, but I saw fear hiding behind his spectacles. For several long seconds, the two men stared at one another. Then Holmes mastered himself. He slowly resumed his seat. The battle had been fought without a single blow, and yet the room felt charged with danger. Milverton's smile returned in full. He knew that he had won this encounter. Or at least, he believed he had. I glanced at Holmes and wondered what thoughts were passing behind those calm gray eyes. I was soon to learn that my friend had no intention of surrendering the field to Charles Augustus Milverton. The moment of danger passed as quickly as it had come. Sherlock Holmes sat down once more, his expression calm, though I could still see the anger in his eyes. Charles Augustus Milverton, however, seemed greatly pleased with himself. He adjusted his coat and gave a small, satisfied smile. He knew that Holmes could not threaten him. The law, strangely enough, stood on the blackmailer's side. At last, Holmes spoke again. He explained that he would make one final effort to raise the money. He asked for a little more time and hoped that some arrangement might still be possible. Milverton listened politely, though there was little sympathy in his face. He replied that he would wait only until the appointed day. After that, the letters would be delivered exactly as promised. He then rose from his chair. Everything about the man was calm and deliberate. He put on his overcoat with great care and buttoned it slowly, as though he had all the time in the world. I remember thinking that he looked less like a criminal than a respectable banker or a successful businessman. That was perhaps the most frightening thing about him. Evil does not always wear a terrible face. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it speaks softly, sometimes it carries a polished walking stick and wears expensive clothes. Milverton gave a slight bow. Then he wished us a pleasant evening. The words sounded almost friendly. A moment later, he walked out of our sitting room. We heard his footsteps descending the stairs, then the opening of the front door. Soon afterward came the sound of carriage wheels rolling away into the cold London night. For a long time, neither Holmes nor I spoke. The room suddenly seemed empty. At last I turned toward my friend. He had not moved. His hands were buried in his pockets, and his eyes were fixed upon the glowing embers of the fire. There was something in his face that I had never seen before. It was not defeat, it was decision. And I knew, even before he spoke, that Sherlock Holmes had already begun to plan his next move against Charles Augustus Milverton. For nearly half an hour, Sherlock Holmes remained perfectly still. The fire had burned low, and the room was filled with the soft glow of red embers. Outside, the winter winds sighed round the corners of Baker Street, but my friend appeared not to hear it. I did not interrupt him. I had learned long ago that when Holmes entered one of his deep silences, his mind was working with extraordinary speed. At last he rose from his chair. It was the sudden movement of a man who had reached a decision. Without a word, he crossed the room and disappeared into his bedroom. A few minutes later, the door opened again. The man who stepped out was not Sherlock Holmes. He looked like a young tradesman from the poorer districts of London. A rough coat hung from his shoulders, a small beard covered his chin, and a clay pipe rested between his lips. Even his walk had changed. I stared at him in amazement. Holmes merely smiled. He said that he might be gone for several hours, and that I need not wait up for him. Then he pulled his cap lower over his forehead and vanished down the stairs. I was left alone beside the fire. I knew my friend too well to ask questions. He had begun his campaign against Charles Augustus Milverton. Yet, I could not imagine what form it would take. Would he search for the stolen letters? Would he discover some weakness in the blackmailer's defenses? Or had he already found a path that was hidden from everyone else? The hours passed slowly. The wind grew stronger, and midnight came and went. Still Holmes did not return. As I sat there in the quiet of Baker Street, I had the strange feeling that our lives were moving toward one of the most dangerous adventures we had ever shared. And somewhere in the darkness of London, Sherlock Holmes was already setting his plan into motion. The next few days were among the most curious I had ever spent in the company of Sherlock Holmes. By day and by night, he disappeared from Baker Street, always dressed in the rough clothing of a working man. Sometimes he returned before midnight. At other times I heard his key in the door only as dawn was breaking. Whenever I questioned him, he merely smiled. He admitted only one thing. His investigations were taking him to Hampstead, where Charles Augustus Milverton lived in a large house known as Appledore Towers. Beyond that, he said nothing. Yet I could tell that his efforts were not wasted. There was a quiet confidence about him that suggested steady progress. He seemed almost amused by some secret known only to himself. At times I found him studying a map of North London, or sitting silently by the fire with a thoughtful expression. Then, without warning, he would spring to his feet, put on his disguise, and disappear once more into the fog. Began to suspect that he had entered Milverton's world in some unexpected manner. Such methods were not unusual for Holmes. I had seen him become a sailor, a stable boy, an old bookseller, and even a clergyman, when the case demanded it. No disguise seemed beyond his powers. Still, there was something different about this affair. It carried a sense of danger unlike any other. The deadline set by Milverton was drawing near. Each passing day brought Lady Eva Brackwell closer to disaster. At last, on a stormy evening, when rain beat against the windows of Baker Street and the wind roared down the chimney, Holmes returned from one of his journeys. He removed his disguise, sat before the fire, and suddenly began to laugh. It was a rare sound. Then he looked at me with shining eyes. "Watson," he said, "you may be surprised to learn that I am engaged to be married." I nearly dropped my pipe. For a moment, I had misheard him. Sherlock Holmes, the most devoted bachelor in London, had just calmly announced that he was engaged to be married. I stared at him in complete astonishment. He leaned back in his chair, holding his hands toward the fire, and there was an expression of amusement in his eyes. At last, he explained. The lady in question was a young servant employed at Appledore Towers, the house of Charles Augustus Milverton. I nearly laughed with relief. This sounded far more like the Holmes I knew. Still, I could not help asking whether he was serious. Holmes smiled. He admitted that the engagement existed only in the imagination of the young woman herself. He had presented himself as a respectable tradesman and had spent several evenings in her company. The purpose, he confessed, had been entirely practical. He required information. And information, to Holmes, was often more valuable than gold. I shook my head in disbelief. There were times when my friend's methods surprised even me. Yet he appeared quite satisfied with the result of his unusual courtship. Through these meetings he had learned a great deal about Milverton's habits. He now knew the arrangement of Appledore Towers almost as well as if he had lived there himself. He knew which rooms were occupied, where the servants slept, and even the habits of the household dog. As he spoke, I began to understand that his long journeys to Hampstead had not been wasted. Every detail had been gathered for a purpose. The firelight danced across Holmes's sharp features. There was excitement in his face now, and something more, determination. At length, he turned toward me. "The matter is becoming urgent, Watson," he said quietly. Then he leaned forward in his chair. "I have reached a conclusion. There is only one way left to save Lady Eva Brackwell." I felt a sudden uneasiness, for I knew that when Sherlock Holmes said there was only one way, that way was often both dangerous and extraordinary. Sherlock Holmes sat quietly for a few moments, his eyes fixed upon the flames. The storm outside had grown stronger. Rain struck the windows, and the wind howled down Baker Street like some restless creature searching for shelter. At last, he spoke. "The letters are kept inside a safe in Milverton's study." I looked at him in surprise. He had learned not only where the papers were hidden, but also the exact room that contained them. Holmes nodded. Through his visits to Hampstead and his conversations with the servant, he had gathered every detail of the house. He knew the position of the study. He knew the movements of the servants. He even knew when Milverton usually went to bed. Then my friend said something that made my blood run cold. He intended to enter Appledore Towers himself, not by invitation, not in daylight, but secretly, under cover of darkness. For a moment, I simply stared at him. The meaning of his words was clear. Sherlock Holmes intended to commit a burglary. I reminded him of the enormous danger. If discovered, his reputation would be ruined. The great consulting detective of Baker Street would become a criminal in the eyes of the law. Holmes listened patiently. Then he spoke with great seriousness. He asked whether taking back stolen happiness from a blackmailer could truly be called a crime. The law might condemn such an act, he admitted, but his conscience did not. A helpless woman had placed her trust in him. Tomorrow was the final day before Milverton carried out his threat. There was no more time. No other path remained. I looked at my old friend sitting beside the fire. His face was calm, and his decision had clearly been made. At that moment, I realized something important. Sherlock Holmes was preparing for the most dangerous adventure I had ever known him to undertake, and he intended to face it alone. For several moments, I could say nothing. The idea of Sherlock Holmes breaking into a man's house seemed impossible, almost absurd. Yet, as I looked at him, I saw that he was entirely serious. The storm outside beat against the windows, and the fire crackled softly between us. Holmes calmly explained his plan. Milverton was a heavy sleeper and retired early. The letters were hidden in a safe inside the study, close to the blackmailer's bedroom. If all went well, the papers could be recovered, and Lady Eva's future saved before dawn. Then he added something that troubled me even more. He intended to go alone. I protested at once. If there was danger, then I could not allow my old friend to face it without me. Holmes smiled and tried to dismiss the idea. He said that I could be of little help, and that the risk was already great enough for one man. But I knew my own mind. For years we had shared every kind of adventure. I had stood beside him in dark alleys, lonely country houses, and even on the edge of death itself. I would not remain safely in Baker Street while he ventured alone to Appledore Towers. I told him plainly that if he refused my company, I would prevent the expedition altogether. The words surprised even me, but that they were true. Holmes looked at me for a long moment. Then, to my relief, a warm smile appeared upon his face. He placed a hand upon my shoulder. "We have been through much together, Watson," he said softly. "Perhaps it is fitting that we should share this adventure as well." At that moment, I knew my decision was final. Whatever happened that night, I would stand beside Sherlock Holmes, and neither of us yet understood just how extraordinary the coming hours would become. Having accepted my decision, Holmes immediately became cheerful again. There was always something remarkable about him. Once his course was chosen, he never wasted energy on doubt or fear. He rose from his chair and crossed to a drawer in his desk. From it, he produced a small leather case. Opening it, he revealed a collection of curious tools that gleamed in the firelight. I recognized some of them at once, while others seemed strange and mysterious. There were fine metal instruments, small keys of unusual shapes, delicate drills, and several polished tools that looked as though they belonged in the workshop of a skilled craftsman. Holmes examined them with obvious satisfaction. He explained that he had assembled the collection for many years, and that they represented the finest equipment available for opening locks and safes. The matter was discussed with such calm seriousness that I almost forgot the nature of the task before us. Then he asked whether I possessed a pair of quiet shoes. Fortunately, I owned a pair with soft rubber soles. Holmes seemed pleased. He also suggested that we cover our faces. A simple black silk mask would be enough. I promised to prepare one. The practical nature of these arrangements made the adventure suddenly seem very real. There would be no turning back. We shared a simple supper while the storm continued outside. At last Holmes consulted his watch. We would leave later that evening, travel to Hampstead, and approach Appledore Towers shortly before midnight. If fortune favored us, we would return to Baker Street before dawn, with Lady Eva's letters safely in our possession. I tried to appear calm, yet my heart beat faster than usual. The rain lashed against the windows, and the wind cried through the streets of London. It seemed to me that the whole city was warning us against what we were about to do. But Sherlock Holmes only smiled at the storm. For him, it was the perfect night for an adventure. At last, the appointed hour arrived. Holmes and I dressed carefully, choosing dark clothes and heavy coats against the bitter cold. We wished to appear like two ordinary gentlemen, returning home from an evening at the theater. Our masks and equipment were hidden beneath our coats. Shortly before 11 o'clock, we left Baker Street and stepped into the storm. The rain had almost ceased, but the wind remained fierce. Dark clouds raced across the sky, and the streets glistened beneath the gas lamps. A cab carried us northward through the sleeping city. Neither of us spoke very much during the journey. I confess that my thoughts were troubled. The excitement of the adventure was mixed with a sense of danger, unlike any I had previously known. We were not hunting a criminal tonight. We were about to become lawbreakers ourselves. Yet whenever I looked at Holmes, I saw no hesitation in him. He sat quietly, his long fingers resting upon his knees, his eyes half closed in thought. At length, our cab stopped in a quiet street near Hampstead. We paid the driver and continued on foot. The night air was sharp and cold. Ahead of us lay open ground and dark trees moving gently in the wind. As we walked, Holmes reviewed the details of the plan. Milverton would already be asleep. The household servants would be in their rooms. Even the fierce dog that guarded the grounds had been safely locked away. Everything, according to Holmes, was in our favor. Soon the lights of London seemed very distant behind us. Before us, hidden among trees and darkness, stood Appledore Towers. Holmes stopped and looked toward the great house. Then he turned to me with a quiet smile. "The adventure begins here, Watson." I felt my heart beat faster as we stepped into the shadows and made our way toward the home of Charles Augustus Milverton. We moved quietly along the edge of the heath, our coats buttoned tightly against the cold wind. At last, Holmes pointed ahead. There, behind a line of trees, stood Appledore Towers. Even in the darkness, I could see that it was a large and handsome house, surrounded by its own grounds and hidden from the road by walls and thick shrubs. Not a single light shone from its windows. The entire place seemed asleep. Holmes appeared perfectly at ease. He knew every part of the property by now. During his strange days in Hampstead, he had gathered enough information to move through the grounds almost like a man returning to his own home. We slipped through a gate and followed a narrow path. The trees sheltered us from the wind, and the silence seemed deeper than ever. I remember hearing only the soft crunch of our footsteps and the distant rustle of leaves. After a short walk, Holmes stopped beside a group of laurels. The house rose before us, dark and silent. He pointed toward a row of windows. One belonged to Milverton's bedroom. Another led into the study where the safe stood. The sight of those windows made my heart beat faster. Somewhere behind them lay the letters that could save Lady Eva Brackwell from ruin. Holmes then reminded me of the dog. The fierce creature had been locked away for the night by the servant whose friendship he had so carefully gained. Without that piece of good fortune, our task might have ended before it began. Then my friend drew out the black silk masks. We covered our faces and became two shadowy figures in the darkness. For a moment we stood without speaking. I felt the strange excitement that always came before danger. Then Holmes gave a small nod. Together we stepped from the shelter of the trees and approached the sleeping house of Charles Augustus Milverton. The great house stood before us in complete darkness. Its long windows reflected only the faint light of the cloudy sky, and not a sound came from within. It seemed impossible that so much fear and suffering could be hidden behind those silent walls. Holmes led the way along the side of the building. We moved carefully, keeping close to the shadows. He had first intended to enter through the door that opened directly into Milverton's study, but upon examining it, he discovered that it was secured from within. To force it open would make too much noise. Without hesitation, he guided me farther along the wall. A greenhouse stood attached to the house. Its glass panels glimmered faintly in the darkness. Holmes produced one of his curious tools and set to work. His hands moved with astonishing skill and speed. Within moments, a small circle of glass had been removed. He reached through the opening and quietly turned the key. The door opened without the slightest sound. A wave of warm air met us at once. The scent of flowers and damp earth filled my lungs. For an instant, I hesitated. The step before me seemed small, yet it carried enormous meaning. Once across that doorway, we would no longer be merely visitors or investigators. We would be trespassers, criminals in the eyes of the law. Holmes glanced back at me. Though I cannot see his expression clearly behind the mask, I sensed his calm confidence. Without a word, he stepped inside. I followed him. The door closed softly behind us. We stood among exotic plants and thick shrubs, surrounded by darkness and heavy perfume. Somewhere beyond the greenhouse lay the study of Charles Augustus Milverton, and somewhere within that study rested the papers for which we had risked everything. For a few moments, either of us moved. The greenhouse was warm and strangely peaceful, filled with the heavy fragrance of flowers that had come from distant lands. It seemed impossible that danger lay only a few steps away. Then I felt Holmes's hand touch my arm. He had remarkable powers of moving in darkness. Even without a lamp, he appeared to know exactly where he was going. He led me between rows of plants and through a door that opened into the house itself. The room beyond was large and silent. A faint smell of tobacco lingered in the air, as though someone had been sitting there not long before. We crossed it without making a sound. Another door opened, then another. At one point, my hand brushed against several coats hanging in a passage, and I realized that we had entered the servants' part of the house. Every small sound seemed greatly magnified. The creak of a floorboard, the whisper of our clothing, even my own breathing sounded dangerously loud. Suddenly, something rushed past my feet. I nearly cried out. A moment later, I realized it was only a cat that had been disturbed by our arrival. Holmes gave my sleeve a reassuring touch, and we continued. At last, we entered another room. A fire still burned there, throwing a faint orange glow across the furniture. The smell of cigar smoke was much stronger. We had reached Milverton's study. At the far side of the room hung a heavy curtain, and beyond it lay the blackmailer's bedroom. Near one wall stood a tall green safe, its polished metal shining in the firelight. Holmes looked toward it, and I saw his eyes brighten. There, only a few steps away, stood the object of our dangerous journey. The letters of Lady Eva Brackwell were almost within our reach. For a few seconds we stood motionless in the study. The room was warm, and the dying fire cast long shadows across the carpet and furniture. The entire house seemed asleep. Before us stood the tall green safe. Its polished brass handles gleamed softly in the firelight, and I found myself staring at it with unusual fascination. Inside that heavy iron box, lay the secrets of many people. There were letters, papers, and memories that had become weapons in the hands of Charles Augustus Milverton. Some had likely brought sorrow to families. Others had probably destroyed friendships and ruined hopes. And among them somewhere were the letters of Lady Eva Brackwell. Holmes crossed the room silently. He examined the safe and then stepped to the door leading into Milverton's bedroom. For several moments he listened. I held my breath. No sound came from beyond. The blackmailer appeared to be sleeping peacefully, entirely unaware that two masked figures stood only a few yards away. I moved toward the outer door and examined it. To my astonishment, it was not locked, nor was it bolted. I touched Holmes upon the arm and pointed this out. Even he seemed surprised. For the first time that night, I saw uncertainty pass across his face. He did not like it. Neither did I. An unlocked door in a house so carefully guarded seemed strangely out of place. Yet there was no time for hesitation. Holmes whispered that I should keep watch while he opened the safe. If anyone approached, I was to warn him at once. Then he knelt before the great green box and opened his leather case. One by one, shining tools appeared in his hands. Watching him at work was like watching a skilled surgeon preparing for an operation. Every movement was calm, precise, and confident. I took my place by the door, my heart beating heavily in the silence, while Sherlock Holmes began the delicate task of opening the safe of Charles Augustus Milverton. I remained beside the door, my eyes moving constantly from one entrance to another. The silence inside the study seemed almost unnatural. Behind me, Sherlock Holmes worked with complete concentration. From time to time, I heard the faintest sounds, the soft click of metal, the gentle turning of a tool, and once the almost silent scrape of steel, nothing more. He handled the safe with extraordinary skill. There was no hurry in his movements, and no sign of uncertainty. He seemed to understand the complicated lock as another man might understand the workings of a clock. The minutes passed slowly. I felt every one of them. At any moment I expected to hear footsteps from the bedroom beyond the curtain, or voices somewhere in the house, yet nothing disturbed the stillness. The fire crackled softly, and outside the wind sighed against the windows. At last, I heard a faint metallic sound, a small click. I turned. Holmes had stopped working. The heavy door of the safe slowly swung open. A gleam of satisfaction appeared in his eyes. Inside were numerous bundles of papers, each neatly tied and carefully marked. The sight filled me with astonishment. So many secrets, so many private lives gathered together and locked inside one iron box. I thought of the misery that those papers represented and felt no pity for their owner. Holmes reached into the safe and selected one packet. The firelight was too dim for him to read the writing upon it, so he drew a small dark lantern from his pocket and prepared to examine the labels. Then something happened. I saw his expression change instantly. He became perfectly still. In the same moment, I heard it too, a sound. Somewhere inside the house, a door had quietly closed. And then came the unmistakable noise of footsteps approaching the study. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was moving through the house. A door had closed in the distance, and now heavy footsteps were coming steadily toward the study. Holmes reacted instantly. The packet of papers slipped back into the safe. In one swift movement, he closed the great green door, gathered up his tools, and hid them beneath his coat. Then he crossed the room and pulled aside the heavy window curtain. With a quick motion of his hand, he ordered me to join him. I obeyed at once. The curtain closed around us, leaving only the narrowest gap through which we could observe the room. The footsteps came nearer, nearer still. Then they stopped, directly outside the study. My heart was beating so loudly that I feared it might betray us. A hand touched the door. The handle turned. The electric light flashed on. The room that had been dim and shadowy only moments before was suddenly filled with bright light. The door closed again. Then came another sound. The soft smell of cigar smoke drifted toward us. Someone had entered the study. Very carefully, I looked through the narrow opening in the curtain. A broad figure stood with its back to us. We recognized him immediately. It was Charles Augustus Milverton. Our calculations had been entirely wrong. He had not gone to bed. Somehow he had returned to the study at the very moment we had opened his safe. For a terrible instant, I thought we were lost. Yet Milverton did not turn in our direction. Instead, he walked calmly across the room and sat down in the red leather chair beside the fire. In his hand was a bundle of papers. He appeared perfectly comfortable, entirely unaware that two masked intruders were hiding only a few feet away. I could feel Holmes beside me, as motionless as a statue. Neither of us dared to breathe. One movement, one sound, and everything would be over. So we waited in silence while Charles Augustus Milverton settled himself comfortably and began to read. I can't clearly describe the tension of those moments. Sherlock Holmes and I stood hidden behind a heavy curtain, scarcely daring to breathe, while Charles Augustus Milverton sat only a few feet away. The bright electric light illuminated every corner of the study. There was no possibility of escape. If the blackmailer chose to rise from his chair or glance toward the window, our adventure would end at once. Milverton seemed in no hurry. He settled comfortably into the red leather chair and stretched out his legs toward the fire. A long cigar rested between his lips, and the smoke drifted lazily through the room. In his hand, he held a legal document. Page after page he read with complete calm, occasionally blowing a ring of smoke into the air. I watched him with growing uneasiness. It seemed impossible that a man could sit so peacefully while danger stood almost within reach of his hand. I also noticed something that filled me with fresh alarm. The door of the safe had not closed entirely. A narrow line remained visible. At any moment, Milverton might lift his eyes and notice it. If he did, he would know instantly that someone had entered the room. I prepared myself for the worst. I had already decided what I would do. Should his gaze fall upon the safe, I would leap from our hiding place and seize him. It was a desperate plan, but I could think of no other. Yet Milverton never looked in that direction. He seemed entirely absorbed in his papers. Time passed with painful slowness. Then I noticed something curious. Several times he took out his watch and examined it. Once he even rose from his chair and sat down again, as though waiting impatiently for someone. The thought suddenly entered my mind. Perhaps he was expecting a visitor. And almost at that very moment, from outside the study, I heard the faint sound of approaching footsteps. The faint sound came again. A soft footstep outside the study, then another. Charles Augustus Milverton heard it well. He lowered the papers in his hand and sat perfectly still. A few moments later, there came a gentle knock at the door. The blackmailer rose at once. "Late," he muttered to himself, glancing at his watch. He crossed the room and opened the door. A figure entered. It was a woman. She was tall and slender, dressed entirely in dark clothing. A heavy veil covered her face, and a cloak was wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Even from our hiding place, I could see that she was deeply agitated. Her hands trembled slightly, and her breathing was quick and uneven. Milverton closed the door behind her and regarded her with his usual cold smile. The sight of the woman seemed to amuse him. He spoke to her quietly, almost pleasantly, as though they were old acquaintances. Yet there was an unpleasant note of mockery in his manner. The woman did not immediately answer. She remained standing in the middle of the room, her entire body tense. The atmosphere changed at once. I felt it immediately. There was something unusual about this meeting. This was no ordinary business visitor. Even Milverton appeared slightly uneasy, though he tried to hide it. He invited her to sit. She refused. He spoke again, calmly and confidently, explaining that he was prepared to discuss certain papers that she wished to sell. Still, the woman remained silent. Then, very slowly, she raised her hands. She removed the veil from her face. I saw Milverton's expression change completely. The smile vanished. His eyes widened in astonishment. For the first time since I had met him, Charles Augustus Milverton looked afraid. And standing only a few feet away, hidden behind the curtain, Sherlock Holmes and I realized that we were about to witness something extraordinary. The woman stood perfectly still in the center of the room. Her veil had fallen back, and the bright electric light revealed a face of striking beauty. Yet it was not beauty that held my attention. It was the expression in her eyes. I had seen anger before. I had seen grief and despair. But never had I seen such cold and terrible determination. She looked at Charles Augustus Milverton as though she were looking upon some poisonous creature. The blackmailer, who only moments before had seemed so calm and confident, had become pale. He knew her, and he had clearly never expected to see her again. The woman finally spoke. Her voice was low and steady. She reminded him of a life that had been destroyed. Long ago she had come to him in desperation, begging for mercy. He had possessed certain letters that could ruin her happiness. She had pleaded with him. She had prayed to him. But Charles Augustus Milverton had shown no kindness. Instead, he had sent those letters to her husband. The result had been tragedy. A good and honorable man had died of a broken heart, and her own life had been left in ruins. As she spoke, I felt a chill pass through me. Even Milverton seemed uncomfortable beneath her gaze. He attempted to defend himself. He spoke of business and necessity, as though his cruelty had been nothing more than a simple transaction. The explanation only seemed to deepen the woman's hatred. Her lips curved into a terrible smile. There was something about her expression that filled me with dread. I glanced toward Holmes. Even he had become intensely watchful. The room seemed strangely quiet. The fire crackled softly, and outside the wind sighed against the windows. Then the woman slowly placed one hand inside her cloak. I felt my heart suddenly begin to pound. Something dreadful was about to happen, and neither Sherlock Holmes nor I could move from our hiding place behind the curtain. The woman withdrew her hand from beneath her cloak. In it was a small revolver. For a single terrible moment, no one moved. Charles Augustus Milverton stared at the weapon in complete disbelief. Then he attempted to recover his confidence. He straightened himself and spoke sharply, warning her that he could summon the servants and have her arrested, but his words no longer carried any power. The woman did not tremble. She did not hesitate. She stepped forward and looked directly into his face. In a quiet voice, she declared that he had ruined her happiness and destroyed an innocent man's life. She had come not to bargain, but to end the suffering that he had inflicted upon others. I shall not dwell upon the dreadful events that followed. There came a sudden burst of violence, swift and shocking. Milverton's confidence vanished completely. The great blackmailer staggered and fell. Then all became still. For several seconds, neither Holmes nor I moved. The room seemed frozen. The woman stood looking down at the motionless figure before her. There was no triumph in her face, only the terrible calm of someone who had finally completed a long and painful duty. At last she turned. Without haste, and without a single glance toward our hiding place, she crossed the room. A moment later, the door opened and closed softly behind her. She was gone. The study fell silent once more. I was about to step from behind the curtain, but Holmes gripped my arm firmly. His eyes were fixed, not upon the door, but upon the safe. The danger had changed everything, and yet our mission remained unfinished. Outside, somewhere in the house, I thought I heard a distant sound. The household was beginning to stir. Time was running out. For several seconds I remained frozen behind the curtain. The room had become terribly quiet. Charles Augustus Milverton lay motionless upon the floor, and a strange woman, who had brought his long career to an end, had vanished into the darkness. And I heard another sound. Voices. Distant at first, but growing louder. The servants had heard the disturbance. They were waking. Sherlock Holmes acted instantly. Without the slightest sign of confusion, he stepped from our hiding place and crossed the door of the study. He locked it. The simple action bought us a few precious moments. Then he turned toward the green safe. I watched in astonishment. Instead of searching for Lady Eva's letters alone, Holmes threw open the safe and began removing bundle after bundle of papers. Each packet represented some hidden sorrow, some secret that Milverton had used to torment his victims. Holmes carried the papers to the fireplace and cast them into the flames. The dry pages caught at once. Orange fire leaped upward. Again he returned the safe. Again he emptied his arms into the blaze. More letters burned. More secrets vanished forever. I suddenly understood his purpose. He was not merely rescuing one woman. He was rescuing every man and a woman whose happiness had been imprisoned inside that iron box. The flames grew brighter. The study filled with the smell of burning paper. Outside, hurried footsteps approached. Someone rattled the handle of the locked door. A voice called out in alarm. Holmes paid no attention. He emptied the final bundle into the fire and watched until the last papers had begun to curl and blacken. The safe now stood completely empty. The reign of Charles Augustus Milverton had ended in ashes. Then Holmes turned to me. His eyes were calm and bright. "Now, Watson," he said quietly, "it is time for us to leave." But even as he spoke, angry voices were gathering outside the door, and I feared our escape might already be too late. The voices outside the study grew louder. Someone was knocking heavily upon the door, and another person was calling for help. The entire household was awakening. Sherlock Holmes, however, remained perfectly calm. The last of the papers had been destroyed, and the fire now blazed brightly in the grate. Nothing remained of Milverton's terrible collection except drifting ashes. Holmes glanced once at the motionless figure upon the floor. Then he moved swiftly to the door that opened onto the veranda. He removed the key and stepped outside. I followed immediately. The cold night air struck my face like ice. Behind us came the sound of angry fists pounding against the locked study door. At any moment it would be forced open. "Quickly, Watson," Holmes whispered. We crossed the veranda and entered the garden. The darkness that had seemed so peaceful earlier was now filled with danger. Lights suddenly appeared in the upper windows of the house. One after another, they burst into life. Shouts echoed through the grounds. Doors slammed. Somewhere, a servant cried out in alarm. The entire household had discovered that something dreadful had happened. We had only a few moments to escape. Then the front door of the great house flew open. Several figures rushed outside carrying lanterns. Their lights moved wildly through the darkness. Someone pointed in our direction. A loud shout followed. We had been seen. "Run!" cried Holmes. At once we dashed across the garden. Branches whipped against our faces as we passed among the trees. Behind us came the sound of running feet. The chase had begun. I heard men shouting to one another, and every second the noise seemed to draw closer. The darkness that had hidden us now seemed filled with enemies. Ahead of us, barely visible in the night, rose the garden wall. It was our only hope of escape, and our pursuers were almost upon us. We ran with all the speed we possessed. The shouts behind us grew louder with every moment. Lanterns flashed among the trees, and I could hear several men crashing through the bushes in pursuit. Holmes knew exactly where he was going. He led the way through a small plantation of trees and toward the far end of the garden. Ahead of us stood the high boundary wall. It seemed impossibly tall. Without hesitation, Holmes sprang upward, caught the top with both hands, and pulled himself over with astonishing agility. I followed immediately. As I climbed, I suddenly felt a hand seize my ankle. One of our pursuers had caught me. For a dreadful moment, I believed I was lost. The man pulled hard, and I nearly fell back into the garden. Acting by instinct, I kicked violently and managed to free myself. Then I threw my body over the top of the wall. Broken glass had been set along its edge, and I felt my hands scrape painfully as I crossed. A moment later, I fell heavily into a patch of bushes on the other side. Before I could rise, Holmes was beside me. He seized my arm and pulled me to my feet. There was no time to rest. The voices behind us were already at the wall. Someone shouted that we had escaped. Another ordered the servants to continue the chase. Together, Holmes and I ran across the open heath. The cold night air burned in my lungs, and the ground beneath my feet seemed endless. Still, we ran. Far behind us, the lights of Appledore Towers shone through the darkness like angry stars. At last, the shouting grew fainter. That fainter still. Finally, there was only the sound of the wind. We had escaped, but neither Holmes nor I slowed our pace, for somewhere behind us lay a dead man, a burning fireplace full of secrets, and one of the strangest nights of our lives. At last, Holmes slowed his pace. We had crossed a great stretch of open ground, and no sound of pursuit remained behind us. The lights of Appledore Towers were now distant and faint, barely visible through the darkness. My breath came heavily, and I leaned against a tree for support. Holmes, though breathing quickly himself, appeared remarkably calm. He listened carefully for several moments. The wind swept across the heath, carrying only silence. At length, he nodded. "We are safe, Watson." Those simple words brought me enormous relief. For the first time since entering Milverton's house, I allowed myself to think about all that had happened. The adventure had begun as an attempt to save one young woman's happiness. Instead, we had witnessed a terrible act of revenge, the destruction of a blackmailer's secret records, and a desperate escape through the darkness. I looked at Holmes. Even now, his expression remained thoughtful rather than excited. He seemed less interested in our own escape than in the extraordinary events we had witnessed. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Then my thoughts returned to the mysterious woman. Who was she? What suffering had driven her to such a desperate deed? And would she ever be discovered? I asked none of these questions aloud. Somehow, the answers seemed unimportant. There are moments in life when ordinary rules become less certain. Charles Augustus Milverton had caused misery wherever he went. Many innocent people had lived in fear because of him. Tonight, that reign of fear had ended. At last, Holmes turned toward me. A faint smile crossed his face. "The papers are gone," he said quietly. "Lady Eva is safe, and so are many others who never knew how close they came to ruin." I looked back once more toward the distant lights. Then Holmes placed a hand upon my arm. "Come, Watson," he said. "Baker Street and a warm fire are waiting for us." Together, we turned and began the long walk home through the sleeping city. The journey back to Baker Street seemed strangely unreal. Only an hour earlier, we had stood hidden behind a curtain in the study of Charles Augustus Milverton. Now we walked through silent London streets, beneath a sky slowly clearing after the storm. Neither Holmes nor I spoke very much. Each of us was occupied with his own thoughts. At last, the familiar door of our lodgings came into view. Never had Baker Street looked more welcoming. Mrs. Hudson was long asleep, and we entered quietly. A few moments later, we were once again seated before our fire, our damp coats hanging nearby, and our masks safely hidden away. For some time, Holmes sat with his long fingers pressed together, the flames reflected in his thoughtful eyes. I finally asked him whether he regretted anything that had happened that night. He shook his head. A cruel man had met his end, and countless victims had been free from fear. The world, he believed, was not poorer for the passing of Charles Augustus Milverton. Yet there remained one mystery: the identity of the woman. Who had she been? How had she suffered? And where had she gone after leaving the house? Holmes admitted that he could not answer those questions. Perhaps, he suggested, it was better that some stories remain unfinished. I looked into the fire and found myself agreeing. There are certain sorrows so deep that they belong only to those who have endured them. At length, Holmes rose and prepared for bed. Before leaving the room, he paused beside the fireplace. "The affair is over, Watson," he said quietly. "Tomorrow London will awaken to a remarkable story." Then he smiled faintly. "But I suspect that Scotland Yard may find certain parts of it difficult to explain." With that, he disappeared into his room, leaving me alone beside the dying fire. wondering what the morning newspapers would reveal about the strange events at Appledore Towers. The following morning dawned cold and clear. Despite the late hour at which we had returned, I rose early, for sleep had brought me little rest. The events of the previous night remained vivid in my mind. Holmes, however, appeared entirely refreshed. We had just finished breakfast when Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor. A moment later, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard entered our sitting room. His face wore an expression of great importance. He greeted us warmly and accepted a chair near the fire. Then, with considerable excitement, he informed us that a most extraordinary crime had taken place during the night at Appledore Towers. I glanced quickly at Holmes. Not a muscle in his face moved. He appeared mildly interested, as though hearing the news for the first time. Lestrade explained that Charles Augustus Milverton had been found dead in his study. Even more remarkable, all of the papers in his safe had been destroyed by fire. The police believed that the crime had been carefully planned. The murderers, according to the inspector, had entered the house for a specific purpose. They had not stolen money or jewels. Instead, they had burned documents. This strange detail greatly puzzled Scotland Yard. As I listened, I found it difficult to remain calm, yet Holmes sat comfortably in his chair, asking an occasional question with perfect composure. Lestrade then leaned forward. The police, he said, had evidence that not one intruder, but two had been present in the house. At those words, my heart gave an uncomfortable leap. I suddenly wondered just how much the inspector truly knew, and I noticed with some concern that Holmes's eyes had begun to sparkle with amusement. Inspector Lestrade seemed greatly pleased with himself. He settled more comfortably into his chair and announced that the police were already making excellent progress. The servants at Appledore Towers had seen two men escaping across the garden. Footprints had been discovered. There had even been a brief struggle at the garden wall. In his opinion, it was only a matter of time before the criminals were identified. I confess that I found my teacup suddenly very interesting. Holmes, however, remained perfectly calm. He merely asked what sort of men the police were seeking. Lestrade smiled. The description was not complete, but it was sufficient to be useful. One of the men, he said, had escaped too quickly to be seen clearly. The second, however, had been observed at close quarters. He was of medium height and strongly built, with a square jaw and a thick neck. He had worn a dark mask over his face. At these words, Lestrade suddenly burst into laughter. The description, he declared, reminded him strongly of me. I nearly dropped my cup. Holmes also laughed, though perhaps rather more heartily than I thought necessary. The inspector found the matter highly amusing. I attempted to join in, though I fear my laughter sounded somewhat forced. Fortunately, Lestrade noticed nothing unusual. He was far too occupied with his own theories. At length he invited Holmes to accompany him to Appledore Towers and assist in the investigation. The request placed me in great suspense. Surely my friend would refuse. After all, he could hardly investigate a crime in which he himself had played such a remarkable part. Holmes folded his hands and became thoughtful. Then he gave an answer that surprised even me. He admitted that he had little sympathy for the dead man. Indeed, he considered Charles Augustus Milverton one of the most dangerous villains in London. And because of that, he said quietly, he had no desire to hunt the people responsible for his death. Inspector Lestrade looked genuinely surprised by Holmes's answer. It was well known throughout London that my friend rarely ignored an interesting mystery, and the death of Charles Augustus Milverton was certainly a remarkable one. Yet Holmes remained entirely firm. He calmly explained, that there were some crimes which the law could not easily punish. There were wrongs that caused terrible suffering while remaining beyond the reach of the courts. Milverton, he said, had been one of those men. The inspector listened with growing curiosity. Holmes admitted openly that he had never liked the blackmailer. Indeed, he considered him one of the most dangerous individuals in the city. Therefore, he could not bring himself to pursue those responsible for the events at Appledore Towers. Lestrade seemed both disappointed and puzzled. He reminded Holmes that murder was murder, regardless of the victim's character. Holmes merely nodded. He did not argue. Instead, he quietly repeated that his sympathies lay not with the dead man, but with the unknown persons who had ended his career. The inspector stared at him for a long moment. Then he rose from his chair. It was clear that he could gain no further assistance from Baker Street. He thanked us politely and prepared to leave. As he reached the door, he remarked that Scotland Yard would eventually uncover the truth. Holmes wished him good luck in his efforts. A moment later, the front door closed behind our visitor. The room became silent once more. I turned toward my friend. For the first time that morning, I noticed that his expression had changed. The amusement had vanished. He now seemed deeply thoughtful, almost troubled. He sat down beside the fire and stared into the flames. There was something upon his mind. At last, he spoke. "Watson," he said quietly, "there is one detail of last night that I cannot forget." I looked at him in surprise. The adventure was over. Yet it seemed that Sherlock Holmes was still pursuing one final mystery. For several minutes after Inspector Lestrade had departed, Sherlock Holmes remained seated beside the fire. His long fingers were pressed together, and his eyes seemed fixed upon something far beyond the walls of Baker Street. I had learned to respect such silences. At length, he suddenly rose to his feet. "By heaven, Watson," he exclaimed, "I have remembered." I looked up in surprise. Holmes began pacing the room. "The face of the mysterious woman," he explained, "had seemed strangely familiar to him from the very moment she removed her veil in Milverton's study. Only now had the memory finally returned." Without another word, he seized his hat and coat. Naturally, I followed. We hurried through the busy streets of London until we reached a fashionable district filled with elegant shops and grand buildings. At last, Holmes stopped before the window of a well-known photographer. The display contained portraits of distinguished men and women from every corner of society. My friend pointed silently toward one particular photograph. I looked. The portrait showed a noble and beautiful lady, dressed in magnificent clothing and wearing a glittering tiara. For a moment, I simply stared. Then I felt a sudden shock. There was the same proud face, the same dark eyes, the same strong features. Though years may have changed her appearance slightly, there could be no doubt. The woman in the photograph was the woman we had seen in Milverton's study. I lowered my eyes and read the name printed beneath the picture. The revelation astonished me. The unknown avenger was no ordinary person. She belonged to one of the greatest families in England. I turned toward Holmes in amazement. He placed a finger to his lips and gave a slight shake of his head. No names were spoken. No further questions were asked. Some secrets, I realized, deserved to remain hidden forever. For some time, Holmes and I remained standing before the photographer's window. The portrait of the noble lady looked calmly out at the busy London street, giving no hint of the terrible scene we had witnessed only hours before. At last, Holmes turned away. Neither of us spoke as we walked back toward Baker Street. I sensed that my friend had already reached a decision. The mystery of the woman's identity had been solved, and it would go no further. When we finally reached our rooms, Holmes removed his coat and stood for a long while beside the fire. Then he looked at me. "There are occasions, Watson," he said quietly, "when justice takes a path that the law cannot follow." I knew immediately what he meant. The woman had suffered deeply. A cruel man had destroyed her happiness and left her life in ruins. Years had passed, yet the wound had remained. At last, she had returned to face the author for misery. The law would call her a criminal, but neither Holmes nor I found it easy to condemn her. As for Charles Augustus Milverton, he had spent his life trading in fear and sorrow. He had fed upon the weaknesses of others and grown wealthy from their suffering. Now his power was gone forever. His secret papers had turned to ashes. His victims were free. I sat down beside the fire and reflected upon the strange chain of events that had brought us to this point. We had entered Appledore Towers, intending to save one woman. Instead, we had witnessed the end of a tyrant and uncovered a tragedy hidden for many years. Holmes looked thoughtfully into the flames. Then he spoke once more. "Some stories, my dear Watson, are not meant for the newspapers." I understood him perfectly. The secret of the woman from the photograph would remain with us alone, and I intended that it should stay so for the rest of my life. The days that followed passed quietly enough, yet the events at Appledore Towers remained very much in my thoughts. London, however, did not remain silent. The newspapers were filled with reports of the extraordinary affair. They spoke of the death of Charles Augustus Milverton, of mysterious intruders, and of the destruction of important papers. No one seemed able to explain exactly what had happened. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed that foreign agents had entered the house. Others believed that enemies from Milverton's past had finally taken revenge. The police questioned servants and neighbors, searched for clues, and examined every possible lead. But they discovered very little. The great blackmailer's secret collection had been destroyed so completely that almost nothing remained. A few blackened scraps of paper were all that survived. I often wondered how many men and women read those newspaper reports with relief in their hearts. Somewhere in London, there must have been people who awoke that morning fearing ruin, only to learn that the letters threatening their happiness had vanished forever. Perhaps a marriage was saved. Perhaps an old friendship survived. Perhaps a family was spared disgrace. They would never know the strange events that had rescued them. Nor would they know that Sherlock Holmes had played a part in their deliverance. As for Holmes himself, he showed little interest in the public excitement. He never mentioned the case unless I brought it up. When I did, he would simply smile and return to his newspaper or violin. Yet I suspected that, deep within his mind, he felt a certain satisfaction. For once, evil had been defeated, not by the courts or the police, but by fate itself. And in the fireplace at Appledore Towers, the terrible power of Charles Augustus Milverton had turned into nothing more than a handful of ashes. As the excitement surrounding the case slowly faded, life at Baker Street returned to its familiar rhythm. Clients once again climbed our 17 steps, carrying their worries and mysteries. Holmes resumed his long hours of study, chemical experiments, and violin playing, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet I noticed a curious change in him. Whenever the name of Charles Augustus Milverton appeared in a newspaper, Holmes would fold the page and set it aside without comment. He never mocked the dead man, nor did he express any triumph over the manner of his end. Instead, there was a thoughtful silence about him. One evening, as we sat by the fire, I asked whether he believed the police would ever discover the truth. Holmes shook his head. Too many clues had vanished in the flames of that study. The destruction of the papers had confused every possible motive. The authorities would continue searching, but they were pursuing shadows. "And the woman?" I asked. For a long moment he did not answer. At last he looked into the fire. "She has suffered enough," he said quietly. There was such certainty in his voice that I asked no more. The flames crackled softly between us. I reflected upon the strange chain of events that had begun with a simple card lying upon our table and had ended in tragedy, mystery, and justice of a most unusual kind. Some adventures leave behind triumph, others leave sorrow. This one left questions. I realized then that there are certain corners of human experience where right and wrong become difficult to separate. Sherlock Holmes understood this better than most men. As for me, I could only sit beside my old friend and watch the fire burn low, wondering whether we had witnessed a crime or the closing chapter of a long-delayed act of justice. Many years have passed since the strange affair of Charles Augustus Milverton, yet I still find myself returning to it in my thoughts. There was something about that adventure which differed from all the others I shared with Sherlock Holmes. Usually our work was simple in one respect. We pursued the guilty and protected the innocent. At Appledore Towers, however, those clear lines seemed to disappear. A blackmailer had died. A woman had taken revenge. And two men who had entered a house with unlawful intentions had destroyed private papers and fled into the night. Yet, when I considered the matter calmly, I found no regret in my heart. I remembered the face of Lady Eva Brackwell and the happiness that had been restored to her. I remembered the countless unknown victims whose secrets had turned to ashes in the fire. Most of all, I remembered the expression upon the face of the mysterious woman as she stood in Milverton's study. It was not the look of a cruel person. It was the look of someone who had carried grief for many long years. I once asked Holmes whether the events of that night had changed his opinion of human nature. He reflected for a time before answering. He said that every person carries hidden burdens, and that even the most respectable houses in London conceal tragedies that never reach the newspapers. His words remained with me. How many smiling faces, I wondered, hid private sorrow? How many lives had crossed the path of Charles Augustus Milverton and been altered forever? The answers were lost with the burning papers. Only the ashes remained. As the fire crackled softly in our sitting room at Baker Street, I realized that some mysteries are not puzzles to be solved. They are reminders of the strange and complicated nature of the human heart. There is one image from that remarkable adventure that has never faded from my memory. It is not the great house at Hampstead, nor the glowing fire that consumed the packets of letters. It is the face of Charles Augustus Milverton himself. I remember him sitting comfortably in his red leather chair, reading his papers by the fire, and believing himself completely safe. He was a man who had built his fortune upon fear. He knew the weaknesses of others and guarded their secrets like treasures. To him, every hidden sorrow was an opportunity, and every human mistake a source of profit. Yet for all his cunning, he failed to understand one simple truth. A person can only be pushed so far. Some wounds never heal. Some griefs do not fade with time. And some acts of cruelty return, years later, to demand their price. Holmes once remarked that the greatest danger often comes not from violent enemies, but from those quiet people whose suffering has been ignored for too long. The mysterious woman who entered Appledore Towers that night had carried her pain for years. Milverton had forgotten her. She had never forgotten him. That, perhaps, was his greatest mistake. As I reflected upon these matters, I realized that the blackmailer had trusted too much in his wealth, his cleverness, and the protection of the law. He believed himself untouchable. Yet in the end, all his schemes, all his secrets, and all his carefully gathered papers vanished in a single night. Nothing remained. No fortune, no power, and no fearful reputation. Only ashes in a fireplace and a name that would be remembered as one of the darkest in London. And whenever I think of Charles Augustus Milverton, I remember the lesson that his life taught me. There are some enemies that money cannot defeat, and some wrongs that time itself refuses to forget. And so I bring this curious adventure to its close. Many cases have passed through the rooms of Baker Street since that winter night in Hampstead. Murderers have been unmasked, treasures recovered, and mysteries solved that seemed beyond all human understanding. Yet the affair of Charles Augustus Milverton has always remained apart in my memory. Perhaps it is because for once Sherlock Holmes and I stood on the uncertain ground between law and justice. We had entered Appledore Towers intending to commit an act that the law would condemn. Yet our purpose had been to save an innocent woman from ruin. Instead, we became witnesses to the final chapter of a tragedy that had begun many years before. A cruel man met his end. Countless victims were freed from fear, and a woman, whose heart had once been broken, vanished back into the shadows from which she had come. Neither Holmes nor I ever spoke of her again. Her secret remained safe with us. As for Lady Eva Brackwell, her marriage proceeded without scandal, and I have every reason to believe that she lived a long and happy life, never knowing how close she had come to disaster. Sometimes I wonder how many other people were saved by the fire that burned in Milverton's study that night. Perhaps dozens, perhaps hundreds. We shall never know. One evening, long afterward, I asked Holmes whether he regretted anything about the affair. He laid aside his violin and thought for a moment. Then he gave one of his rare and gentle smiles. "There are occasions, my dear Watson," he said, "when the world quietly sets its own balance right." That was all. The fire burned softly in Baker Street, and neither of us spoke again. Yet, whenever I remember the name of Charles Augustus Milverton, I think not of his wealth or his power, but of that final lesson. Secrets may rule lives for a time, but truth, justice, and memory have a way of finding their own path in the end.